Welcome to Food for Thought. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, and I am your host. Thank you for listening to this podcast if you're new, and thank you for listening if you've been listening for any length of time. This is the 18th year of the Food for Thought podcast, and today is a historical day because it is the first time I am recording the recording of the podcast, filming the recording of the podcast for YouTube. So you'll be able to watch this video on YouTube and you'll be able to listen to it wherever you get your podcast. Today, we are returning to a topic that was the very first topic of the Food for Thought podcast back in 2006, and that is protein. Today's episode is, are you eating enough protein? I wasn't. Spoiler. And I'm so excited to get into this topic with you. Welcome, everyone. I hope you're doing fabulously well. Today, we are diving into a topic that dominates the cultural conversation, a topic that vegetarians and vegans are asked about endlessly, and one that many people assume can only come from animal flesh. And of course, that is protein. Before we begin, I want to add this disclaimer that this episode is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the guidance of your physician or other qualified healthcare professional with any questions you may have regarding your health, medical condition, or before making any changes to your diet, exercise, or medication. So I became vegan back in 1999, or as I like to say, I removed the blocks to the compassion that was always inside of me, although it's a lot faster to say I became vegan. So I became vegan in 1999, and I started teaching cooking classes and workshops in 1999, 2000. I was on the Food Network and filmed and produced a cooking DVD in 2004. And I started this podcast in 2006. And from the beginning, of course, protein was always something I addressed in all of these mediums for all of these years. Protein was and remains the number one question people ask when they hear you are or that you're contemplating becoming vegan or even vegetarian, to be really honest, but to a lesser degree. And of course, the question related to protein is, where are you getting it? Can you get enough? The implication being that it's difficult to consume enough protein if you're eating only plants, if you're eating only fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds and beans and mushrooms and grains and herbs and spices. Now, people cannot be faulted for thinking that protein comes only from animal products. In the United States alone, we have been inundated with that message for decades. We learned it in schools. We saw it in nutrition courses. We absorbed it through advertising, and we internalized it from government-issued food guides. The USDA, which is the United States Department of Agriculture, is one of the two main agencies responsible for issuing the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. The other is the United States Department of Health and Human Services, also known as the HHS. However, the USDA plays a leading role, particularly in how those guidelines are implemented in food programs, like school lunches, like SNAP, or WIC, which are the supportive food, government supported food programs. And it says it on the tin. It's the US Department of Agriculture. It's a government body whose mission is to support and promote American agriculture, including meat, dairy, and eggs. Many health experts, many nutrition scientists, and watchdog organizations have argued that the USDA's dual role creates an inherent conflict of interest. It is tasked both with supporting and promoting U.S. agriculture, including meat, dairy, and eggs, and with issuing nutrition guidelines intended to protect public health. Because of this, critics have called for the dietary guidelines for Americans to be overseen by a non-agricultural, health-focused agency, such as the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, or the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, to remove industry influence and ensure that the guidelines are based purely on science and public health outcomes. But this is the way it's been since the beginning, and it continues to be the case today that the USDA is part of issuing these guidelines. The government's nutrition recommendations reflected the interest of the industries they were designed to support, with an outsized emphasis on animal products. And those messages stuck. So let's take a look at kind of the history of what these government guidelines have been, starting in the 1950s when we had the Basic Four. So from 1956 to about 1979, the USDA promoted the Basic Four food groups. I remember these because I was alive, not in 1956. I was alive in 1979. And so the Basic Four categories were milk, meat, fruits and vegetables, and breads and cereals. The guide wasn't organized around macronutrients like protein, carbohydrates, and fats. The category wasn't protein, and here are the many sources of it, plant and animal based. The category was just meat, with the implicit and explicit direction to eat it for various nutrients, including protein. Same with other nutrients like dairy. Rather than recommending calcium and all of the plant and animal sources of it, they just pointed to dairy. In this case, they called it milk. The message wasn't, here's a variety of ways to meet your nutritional needs of calcium. It was just drink milk for strong bones, eat meat for protein. And that was the way it was. In 1977, the Senate's Dietary Goals, was the name of this Senate committee, urged Americans to reduce fat, saturated fat, reduce sugar, and reduce cholesterol. And you can see what was going on at that time for them to make those suggestions. And this suggestion was also to increase complex carbohydrates. Now, this wasn't a formal federal guide, but it marked a turning point, prioritizing macronutrient balance over single food groups. Okay, a little bit of progress. Then in 1980, the first official dietary guidelines for Americans were released, and they would continue to be revised every 5 years. These guidelines began recommending eating a variety of foods, avoiding too much fat and cholesterol, and cutting down on sugar. Then we fast forward from 1980 to the 1990s. By the 1990s, we started to see a shift, at least in how the information was presented. In 1992, the USDA introduced the Food Guide Pyramid, remember this, which moved away from listing 4 rigid food groups and began illustrating relative proportions. Grains formed the base, followed by vegetables, fruits, dairy, and at the top, meat and beans was the category. For the first time, meat and plant-based proteins were grouped together. While the framing still gave meat top billing, this marked a subtle but significant departure from earlier models. It was the beginning of a broader view. And I remember thinking when it came out, well, at least meat is relegated to the top, smallest portion of this pyramid, and was pleased about that, but was also very aware that beans was in the same category. And of course, it makes no sense to relegate beans to that same narrow space. Grouping meat and beans implies that we should be eating them in equal amounts, when in reality, they have vastly different nutritional profiles. And of course, at this time, they still weren't empowering people to understand that protein is the macronutrient we need, and that exists in plants as well as animal flesh and fluids and ferments. So yes, it was a step in the right direction to see meat presented as a much smaller portion, but it still wasn't that helpful in terms of helping people really unpack protein from animal flesh. And then that brings us to 2010, when the new dietary guidelines for Americans were issued. And these guidelines emphasized variety and nutrient density and portion control, but still fell short in clearly distinguishing between whole and processed foods, or in encouraging a significant shift away from animal products. And from those new guidelines came a new visual representation, doing away with the food pyramid altogether. In 2011, just the year after those new guidelines were released, the USDA launched MyPlate with a simple, one might say simplistic, image of a plate divided into fruits, vegetables, grains, and protein, with dairy represented as a little circle, like a cup on the side. And so importantly, you look at this plate and you see mostly plants, right? That's a good thing. And instead of seeing meat as a category, protein became its own category, implicitly suggesting that there are multiple sources of protein, not just animal flesh. And I remember when these guidelines came out thinking that is absolute progress, because now when people see protein, they can think of it more broadly. I do think people still interpret protein to mean animal flesh. I do think it's changing. I absolutely 100% do. I see a lot of conversations where there's a distinction between animal protein and plant protein. So I do think it's changing, and we're going to talk a lot more about protein. This is just the very beginning of this episode. But I do think a lot of people still continue to interpret protein to mean animal flesh, because that's how we've been conditioned. Now, this was just a visual representation saying protein as a category. And I think it's a good one. On the website, if anyone ever goes to the website, myplate.gov, and you click on protein, you will see that there is an entire explanation for vegans, for vegetarians, to make sure that they're getting their protein, and they name them specifically. They name beans, peas, lentils, nuts, seeds, and soy products. And then they talk about animal protein as well. But at least we're seeing this distinction between plant and animal protein. So definitely an improvement. And I think there will be more improvements moving forward. Looking ahead, the 2030 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, they have already submitted their recommendations, and there are signs of real change. First, there is a strong push to prioritize plant-based proteins over animal flesh. That means giving foods like beans and lentils and peas a more prominent place in the protein category, above meat, above poultry, and above eggs. The committee even recommends moving beans fully into their own category, into their own protein category, because right now they're in vegetables as well as legumes. So they want to put beans into the protein category to better reflect their nutritional value. I support that. Not that anyone's asked me. And second, the committee is recommending a reduction in red and processed meat consumption, citing the links to heart disease, cancer, and other chronic illnesses. In its place, they suggest shifting toward legumes, nuts, and other plant-based sources of protein. I like that too. Of course, we all want to see just recommendations where it's only plants and no animal flesh, no animal fats, no animal fluids, no animal protein. But this is the way it works. This is what it looks like. And I think this is real progress. These are just recommendations for now. They could significantly reshape how the government talks about protein and what it promotes and pays for in schools, in public health programs, in food assistance policies, and more. So all of that is good news. At the same time, we still need to keep emphasizing that protein is a macronutrient. It's not a food group. So that is why I think in so many people's minds, we equate protein with animal flesh. And I wanted to give you kind of a little brief history of that. You've probably come across that in your protein travels. But let's talk more about protein. What does it mean, and why is it so important? Let's get down to basics. So if protein is not a food group, what is it? It's a macronutrient. It's one of the three main nutrients we need, our body needs, in large amounts alongside carbohydrates and fat. Different than micronutrients. Micronutrients we need in smaller amounts like vitamins, minerals. Macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, and fat. Each has a different primary role. Carbohydrates are our body's preferred fuel source. Fat is our long-term energy reserve and insulation, and protein is our building and repair material. Protein's job is profound and cannot be overstated. It's made up of amino acids. We already know that. It's the raw material our bodies use to build and repair muscle, to strengthen bones, to maintain skin and hair, to produce enzymes and hormones, to transport nutrients, and to support immune function. Without enough protein, our body's construction crews can't keep up with repairs, and we start losing structural integrity. Our muscles shrink, our bones weaken, our recovery slows. So I mentioned amino acids. We have all heard of amino acids, but what are they really? And what do they have to do with protein? Amino acids are the tiny building blocks that make up protein. I love this analogy. I've heard analogies around Legos, and again, kind of furthering this construction building analogy, but I prefer this one. And I think this might resonate with you as well. So, amino acids are the tiny building blocks that make up a protein, like individual letters of an alphabet. On their own, they're small and simple, but when they're arranged in the right sequence, they form the words and sentences our bodies rely on, such as muscle fibers, right, for movement and strength. Enzymes like lactase, for instance, which breaks down the milk sugar lactose, which is something we all consume when we're babies and we're consuming our own mother's milk. Hormones, many hormones are proteins like insulin for blood sugar regulation and growth hormone for tissue repair. Antibodies, which help our immune system fight out viruses and bacteria. There are 20 amino acids in total. Our bodies can make some of these amino acids, but 9 are called essential because we can't make them. We have to get them, eat them from food. Among these, and we're going to be talking about this in future episodes, are branched chain amino acids, BCAAs. You might see these around. People are talking a lot about these: leucine, isoleucine, and valine. These are named for their unique chemical structure and their key role in muscle repair and growth. So we're going to be talking about this, especially as it relates to post-exercise and muscle building and resistance training. So stay tuned for that, more about BCAAs. And of course, the important part, it doesn't matter if those amino acids come from animals or plants. Just like the letter A is the same whether it's printed in a novel or a newspaper, the amino acid is identical no matter its source. Can you replay that again and again, please? Because this is the big misconception, and this is why people keep emphasizing protein and animal flesh or any animal product. So it doesn't matter what the source is. The amino acid is identical. A leucine molecule from lentils is the same leucine molecule found in chicken. Our bodies don't care about the source. They just take the letters and assemble the words and sentences they need to make the proteins that keep us alive, strong, and functioning. So why is it often said that it's easier to get more protein from animal sources and animal products? It's not because the amino acids are better or different. They are identical. The difference comes down to how concentrated they are. Animal tissues, muscle, milk, eggs, are made mostly of protein and water. So they're naturally very protein dense. Plants, on the other hand, tend to store their energy as carbohydrates or fat. And their protein is often diluted by that fiber and water, which is not a drawback, because that fiber and water are part of what make plant foods so nourishing and so satisfying. It's just that when it comes to protein, they're not as concentrated. So we're getting fewer letters per bite. Does that make sense? That's why 100 grams of cooked chicken has roughly 31 grams of protein, while 100 grams of cooked lentils has about 9 grams. The letters are the same. It's just that with the lentils, we're getting few letters per bite, even though we're getting plenty of other gifts like fiber, like antioxidants, like phytochemicals, like vitamins and minerals. So we'll come back to the plant foods that do pack in more protein because they exist. There are higher protein plant foods and there are medium and there are lower. But the point here is that while plants may have less concentrated protein, they come with all the good stuff: the fiber, the phytochemicals, the antioxidants, the anti-inflammatory compounds. Animal-based sources might be more concentrated in protein, but they don't have any of those benefits. And they often come packaged with dietary cholesterol, saturated fat, antibiotics, hormones, other contaminants like heavy metals when we're talking about aquatic animals. And that's why I've always said skip the middle animal. When we skip the middle animal, we get everything we need, and we avoid getting the things we don't, and the things that are harmful to our health, to the animals, to the environment. I mean, there's so much we can say about this, but that is the point. Protein is essential. Animal protein is not. So let's look at how much is recommended and why I have doubled, even a little more than doubled, my own protein intake, and what I would say differently today about protein compared to what I said back in 2006 when I did that very first podcast on protein. I just want to take a quick break to say thank you to everyone who is supporting this podcast. It is a listener-supported podcast, and we are building a beautiful community over on Substack, joyfulvegan.com and ColleenPatrick-Goudreau.com. Now go right over to Substack. I don't have a separate website anymore on WordPress, and it's kind of monumental. It's been a really scary transition, all of this over to Substack, but a really invigorating one. We have private chats, we have live videos that go out just for my paying subscribers. We have one-on-ones, we have exclusive content for you, and I have a lot of free content over there. I always give away everything for free, but this is an opportunity to have a more intimate connection with me and other like-minded people. And it means you're also showing that you value this work that I do through the podcast, through the articles, the recipes, and everything I put out everywhere. So if you want to head over to joyfulvegan.com, it'll bring you right over to Substack. It's an incredible place. You can become a subscriber today. And thank you so much. Okay, my very first podcast episode was in 2006. It was called The Protein Myth and Vegetarianism. Yes, I was vegan then, and the podcast was vegan then, but it was called Vegetarian Food for Thought. In fact, the cooking classes that I taught were also called vegetarian cooking classes. This was 2006, and I was using the term vegetarian as a catch-all. The word vegetarian actually originally referred to not eating any animal products. It actually kind of meant vegan in the original inception of the word. And at the time, the word vegan was just not as known and not as popular. Eventually, I changed the name of the podcast to just Food for Thought. But the point is, that was the first episode. And when I started hinting in my social media channels that I'm working on a new podcast episode on protein, a number of people asked if I'm correcting anything I said in that very first episode. Do I stand by what I said then? Would I change anything? Now, of course, if I needed to update something or change my perspective over 18 years, I would be transparent about that. There is nothing wrong with changing your mind about things and evolving and growing and, kind of thinking through things differently. And of course, the data has changed. There's new research, thank goodness. And so, of course, there's new information emerging all the time. And it would not be a big deal if I had to change something from that episode. I guess maybe the question also is, would I ever take down something that I have posted? And I am leaving that podcast episode up because I stand by everything I said. Mostly because at the time and now, my intention has always been to dispel the myth that animal protein is somehow superior to plant protein, or that the only way to get it is through animal products, or that we can't get enough if we're eating only plants. And that's what I did in that first episode. And so I'm going to share my key points from that episode back in 2006. And again, I started this work back in 1999. And I want to just emphasize that this has always been my mission in the last 26 years, is to debunk myths and to empower people. And that's what I've done. And so what were those points? One of the things I said was that protein is essential and that getting enough on a plant-based diet is a non-issue as long as you're eating a variety of healthy foods and getting enough calories. I said that some plant foods are higher in protein than others, but all plant foods have protein because all foods have amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. Some are just higher in certain amino acids than others. I said you don't have to combine uh, foods to make complementary proteins at every meal. Your body will assemble all those letters to make the words you need to make the protein you need over the course of the day. True protein deficiency, kwashiorkor, is virtually non-existent in the United States, where most people, vegans included, consume more protein than they need. True protein deficiency is seen in places where there's severe food scarcity. I said excess animal protein is linked to health problems like cancer and kidney stones and osteoporosis and gout. I said that the RDA for protein and for every nutrient is the same for vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters. The only difference is where you get those nutrients. I said the position of the American Dietetic Association, which is now called the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, related to vegetarians and vegans. The position paper said that appropriately planned vegetarian and vegan diets are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits for the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. This applies across all life stages, from pregnancy to older adulthood, and includes athletes. I said there's no broccoli lobby spending millions to convince you that broccoli is a real source of protein, but the meat, dairy, and egg industries have been pushing this message for decades about animal products. I said the idea that meat, dairy, and eggs are the only real sources of protein comes from marketing, not biology. Some of the largest, strongest animals on the planet, the elephants, gorillas, buffalo, thrive on plants, and so can we. And finally, I said that you can get all the protein you need from plants. So do I stand by these points? Yes. Pretty much I do, because like I said, my goal was to dispel the myth that animal protein is superior to plant protein. Frankly, I think dispelling this myth is the goal of many vegetarians, many vegans, many animal advocates. And I think that's good. I think we have a lot of myths to dispel, but I think we have to be really careful that we don't get attached to a particular narrative such that we don't evolve with the new information, and that we get so stuck, we don't want to get so stuck, that we risk losing credibility or even creating harm if we don't also acknowledge that certain life stages and lifestyles may call for more protein. So that's what we're going to talk about. So for example, I personally wouldn't necessarily phrase this the same way today. This is what I said in that episode. True protein deficiency, kwashiorkor, is virtually non-existent in the US. That is true. I stand by that. Where most people, vegans included, consume more protein than they need. That first part is true. Kwashiorkor is extremely rare in the United States and other economically developed nations, and occurs in only very specific circumstances in those places, such as when there's severe caloric restriction from anorexia, from severe illness, or from extreme forms of malnutrition. But the second part depends on how we define need. If we mean the bare minimum to prevent deficiency, then yes, I will stand by most people consume more protein than they need. But if we're talking about optimal for aging well, for maintaining muscle, for supporting an active lifestyle, many people, including vegans, could fall short without some intention, without some thought as to where they are in those different stages or what their lifestyle is like. So even before I started researching and writing this episode and the ones that will follow, I've been getting comments and emails from people who are expressing frustration with what they're seeing as a trend that protein is such a hot topic now. Now, of course, when we see protein being a hot topic right now, and it is, it's framed around the idea that we need more of it. And of course, the implication is that the extra protein we need is animal-based, that it should come from animal sources, from chicken breasts and from chicken's eggs and from Greek yogurt and whey shakes. And we're seeing all of this. And I get the frustration because for years, we've had to push back against the myth that you can't get enough protein on a plant-based diet. Many of us, like me, have spent decades repeating, you can get all the protein you need from plants, because it's true. So when the conversation swings back to protein, as it has now, and especially when it's framed as animal protein being the gold standard, it can feel like we're back to square one, or that we haven't progressed at all. And I think we have progressed. The meat Dairy and egg industries, however, have not progressed. They are still heavily invested in their business model, which is that they want to sell their products. And they are invested heavily in marketing protein as a key selling point for their products. And in recent years, they're leaning into, of course, that high protein trend that we're in even more. They're very good at taking new research, in this case, on the benefits of protein for things like healthy aging and muscle maintenance and satiety, and using it to brand their products as being essential and primary and superior. It's not the first time we've seen this. We've seen this cycle. We've seen carbohydrates demonized. We've seen fat demonized, and we're seeing this again. This is just what it looks like. But here's where I want to acknowledge the nuance. The current protein conversation isn't entirely without merit. The truth is, yes, most vegans who eat enough calories from a variety of plant foods meet the minimum requirements for protein. That is true. But vegans is a very broad category. We have to consider factors like age, like lifestyle, like activity level, like life stage. Did I say stage? Life stage? No, age. It just rhymed. It sounded like I said stage. Age, lifestyle, life stage, activity level, health status, body composition goals, and overall calorie intake. We have to consider those. And B, newer research is indeed showing that for optimal health, especially for maintaining muscle mass and metabolic health and bone density as we age, those minimums may not be enough. And this applies to all of us, whether we're vegan, a vegetarian, or not. What frustrates me is, of course, that in mainstream coverage, the solution presented is almost always animal protein. I am seeing a shift. I'm not sitting around watching every single news show where people are talking about our need to consume more protein, but I am seeing people talk about plant protein more and more. So I think there is a shift, but again, I understand the frustration, because when we're pushing, or when they are pushing animal protein so much, there's just so many negative consequences for that, for the animals, for the environment, for us. And so I get the frustration that some people can feel that protein is being overhyped, but I really think this is a moment for us to step into the conversation, not out of it, and not just say, no, 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 it's enough. We're getting enough. Stop it. This is ridiculous. I think we're really going to keep watching this movie just keep going by us, and we're going to miss the credibility boat. We're just going to miss it. And so my hope is that by the end of this episode, you will feel empowered and excited to answer the questions. Well, where are you getting your protein? I need more protein. I can't get it from plants. How can you get enough protein? How can you get more protein being vegan, being plant-based? I want you to feel like you can answer this and to really lean into this conversation with confidence and pride and joy and with the right information. So there's a lot to say, and I'm going to be breaking this content up because I have a lot to say about this. I've already said a lot, but I have more to say. So to be clear, none of this undermines the plant protein argument. It is true that all plant foods contain protein because they all contain amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. You can absolutely point out that there's protein in broccoli, that there's protein in bananas, that there's protein in carrots, because there is. But if we stop there, especially as advocates eager to prove that plants can provide everything we need to thrive, not just survive, we risk missing the bigger picture. Those foods do have protein, but you'd have to eat a lot of bananas to even reach the recommended daily allowance. The more helpful and honest conversation is about where we find the higher protein plant foods, the ones that deliver higher amounts of and more concentrated amounts of that protein, so we can meet not just the minimum, but the optimal intake for our needs. I have always been interested in optimal. I am not interested in good enough. I never have been. For taste, for experience, for life, for nutrients, for energy, I want optimal. And that's what we should all want. And that's what we want to convey to those, especially who are leaning in, who are interested, and to those who are skeptical. So we may want to shift from simply trying to dispel the myth that plant protein exists, right? Because it does, to also talking about which plant foods give us the biggest boost, especially when our needs are higher. And then, of course, continue to talk about all of the other benefits, the fiber, the antioxidants, the phytochemicals, none of which are in animal protein. But as advocates for what remains truly the most healthy and the most compassionate way to eat, if we're keeping up with the science, if we're following the research, and if we're really hearing the concern that people have who are interested, but really want to make sure they're going to thrive, when they ask us about protein, we have to be honest. There are times we may need more protein in our lives, and getting it from plants may require a bit more intention. Not because plant protein is inferior, it is not, but because it's less concentrated, as I've said. So it's not so much that I would change what I've said as much as I would emphasize certain things more, namely what the current protein recommendations are, whether they have been updated, whether they're high enough, where those recommendations are coming from, and just as importantly, what the research tells us about the needs of specific groups, like people in their 50s and beyond, like women in peri and postmenopause, like those doing strength training regularly. And I think for me, this all feels much more significant because now I'm in some of those categories when I wasn't before. Everything I'm saying applies to you wherever you are on this journey, whether or not you fit into those categories. So I hope you'll keep listening because one day you will be in one of these categories, God willing. And so let's take a look at what the recommendations are so that this is something we can understand in terms of not only conveying the needs to other people who are interested, but also so that we can make choices where we are thriving the most. So let's look at what the protein recommendations are, starting with the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance. This number comes from the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA, and it has been the gold standard since the 1940s. The current RDA for protein, you've probably heard this before, is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Now, I am going to make a very deep blanket apology right now because I think the United States is probably the last nation in the world that is not using the metric system. And so I am going to have to tell you that I am not going to use the metric system because that is not what I know. And I am going to talk about pounds, not kilograms. I apologize to all of you around the world who are using the very smart metric system that I never learned. Yes, I can convert. Yes, I can do it. But I do not want to give both kilograms and pounds. I'm just going to give pounds. So I apologize in advance. So that is the last time I'm going to give you kilograms. So the current RDA in the United States is 0.36, 0.36 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So for a 130-pound woman, that's about 47 grams of protein. Now, keep in mind that this is not intended to represent an ideal amount or an optimal amount of protein. It's just the minimum amount required to prevent deficiency in 97 to 98% of healthy individuals. And prevent deficiency, it has. As I said, we do not have kwashiorkor, or it is very rare in this country. But that is all the RDA is designed to do. It does not take into account the many factors that can increase your needs, your age, your life stage, your activity level, your training goals, and your overall health. So we have prevented deficiency, which is a good thing. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, for us, when we're calculating how much protein to consume each day, do we want just not deficient or do we want optimal? What's more, Although nutrition science has advanced significantly over the last several decades, the recommended dietary allowance, the RDA for protein in the United States, has remained essentially unchanged for more than 70 years. But while the number hasn't shifted, there is ongoing debate today. Is that, particularly for certain populations, is this RDA enough for those who are older, those who would benefit from higher protein intakes? Now, the current RDA does give specific guidance for children, for pregnant women, for lactating women. I've talked about that for years, and for other groups, especially athletes and older adults. But those are not official RDAs for athletes and older adults. Those are only expert recommendations. And so we do see higher amounts for those groups. But that RDA of that 0.36 grams per pound of body weight, it's using an old method called nitrogen balance. And like I said, that nitrogen balance was designed to find the minimum needed to avoid deficiency, not the amount needed for optimal health. There are newer methods like the indicator amino acid oxidation method. And that method suggests that most people, especially older adults, need more. You also see organizations like the European Society for Clinical Nutrition and Metabolism recognize higher protein needs for certain populations, and they recommend about 0.54 grams per pound of body weight just to maintain muscle with age. And that's something we have to consider as well. When I see recommendations from certain people, even experts in the plant-based world, we're talking about maintaining muscle as we age, not losing it. I don't want to just not lose muscle. I want to gain it. I want to strengthen, right? So that's what we're seeing from bodies like that organization, where they're recommending a bit more, like 0.54. If you're active, if you're strength training, if you're aiming to thrive as you age, that range from that organization is a bit higher, from 0.73 to 1 gram of protein per body weight. So keeping in mind both the RDA 0.36 and the higher targets suggested by the IAAO technique, the 0.54 or up to a pound, depending on your activity level, let's take a look at what some of the leading plant-based experts actually recommend, because I think this is where most vegans are getting their guidance. There's a lot of experts out there, but I'm just going to name a handful. So Dr. Michael Greger from nutritionfacts.org, he generally sticks to the RDA, recommending 0.36 to 0.41 grams of protein per body weight per day for adults who consume a variety of plant-based foods, whole plant foods. What about Brenda Davis? Brenda Davis, registered dietitian, internationally acclaimed speaker, one of the leading authorities on plant-based nutrition. Her book, Becoming Vegan, was my Bible when I first became vegan, and it's what I used to share so much of the information that I was sharing with my audience. Well, she has a lot to say about this, because she and Vasanto Molina have just recently published yet another book. I think they have 50 books now. And this book is called Plant-Powered Protein, Nutrition Essentials, and Dietary Guidelines for All Ages. It's a deep dive into the science of protein from a plant-based perspective, and I highly recommend it. It covers everything from the needs of infants and children to athletes and older adults. And in it, Brenda makes the case that while the RDA may be adequate to prevent deficiency, the evidence is growing that many people, particularly older adults, those with certain chronic conditions and active individuals, may benefit from more. So she cites the groups like the European Society for Clinical Nutrition and Metabolism and other experts globally that recommend about 0.54. So she goes on the upper limit of that range to about 0.54. So now we have 0.36, Michael Greger and RDA. We have 0.54, Brenda Davis. Let's look at Simon Hill. He's an Australian nutritionist. I'm sure many of you listen to his podcast called The Proof Podcast. He has a book called The Proof is in the Plants, which is basing all of his information on evidence-based health and performance. And he does tend to aim his guidance at people who are physically active, including recreational exercisers and serious athletes. And I just want to say again, we're going to talk about this in future episodes, but what I want for you is that you push yourself out of maybe the sedentary category into recreational exercisers. When we hear a category like athletes. I think for a long time I would say, well, I'm not a competitive athlete, so I'm not in that category. Yes, I am. Based on the amount of cardiovascular work that I do and the amount of weightlifting I'm doing, I am. I am not a competitive athlete, but I am a recreational athlete. And so even if you hear someone like Hill or Brenda Davis or organizational bodies who are recommending higher amounts for active individuals, what I want for you is that you aspire to be that active individual, certainly not sedentary. That's what we want for you, for your longevity, and for you to be able to thrive. And so his principal, Simon Hill, who recommends a higher amount than Brenda yet, his recommendations apply to you wherever you are, because again, I think we want to aspire to, to a higher place than where we are right now. And so he is giving recommendations for anyone who's looking to support muscle maintenance, metabolic health, healthy aging, all of it. And so he goes a little higher. He has a bit of a higher range for people who are serious athletes, going up to about 0.73 to 1 pound of gram per pound of body weight. But he talks about a sweet spot for most active vegans, and that's about 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight. And then one more expert I want to cite is Maxime Seguin from Fit Vegan Coaching. He's fantastic. If you haven't followed him, follow him online and on his YouTube channel. And he has a podcast called Fit Vegan Podcast, which I've had the pleasure of being on. He has a really interesting story, but basically what he does right now through Fit Vegan Coaching is help people, especially people who are between the ages of 45 and 80. He would kind of provide that range. I'm sure he'd help you if you're younger or older outside of that range, to build strength, to improve body composition, people who are looking to support long-time health with a whole foods plant-based approach. And he's got a wonderful story, and I really like his approach. So he kind of goes in around about the 0.8 grams of protein as well. So we've got a range from 0.36 which is the RDA and Michael Greger, to about 0.54, about Brenda Davis. And then you've got a range from 0.73, 0.8 up to a pound for Simon Hill and for other organizations and for Fit Vegan. And so for decades, I pretty much followed the RDA. I was following basically what I knew to be about the amount that I was getting to be fine, to be good, to be enough. I did not track my protein in my 20s. I never tracked my protein in my 30s. I didn't even track my protein in my 40s. I was tracking calories probably in different phases of those decades, for weight maintenance and weight loss, but I never tracked my macros. I never tracked especially my protein until now, until recently. And that's because something has significantly changed for me. Something has significantly changed my perspective. My habits have changed. My meals have changed. My fitness has changed. My consumption of protein has changed. And it has been incredibly invigorating and exciting and empowering. And I think I use this phrase probably too much, but it has been a game changer. And I cannot wait to share with you what I have discovered, what I am implementing now for you wherever you are on your journey. And because I have taken up enough of your time here on the video, here on the audio podcast, I'm going to save that for the next episode. So I hope you are following Food for Thought. I hope you're sharing it. I hope you're giving it reviews. I hope you can support it by being a supporter. We used to have our Patreon sponsorships. This is so much better, everybody. I can give you so much more for what you give me. It means we have fewer levels. So it means you only have really 2 to choose from. So it's that same amount you can pay either annually or monthly. And then there's a VIP amount. And as I said, this is listener sponsored. And everything you do to support me just goes right back out into the world. So if you value this podcast, I hope you will consider supporting it. And before we go, I just want to remind you that we do have trips coming up in 2026. We had a couple cancellations. It's really kind of funny and sad that a lot of our cancellations are usually because someone has a companion animal who's going through some kind of health issue and they don't want to leave home during that time. So we had a couple cancellations for Japan, which is in April of 2026, which is one of our most popular and incredible trips. You will not be able to go to Japan and have the experience you have with us if you go on your own. I can promise you that. So if you're interested, go to joyfulvegantrips.com. Check out the details. We go from Kyoto to Hiroshima to Kanazawa to Tokyo, and it's just a life-altering trip. We also have space available for our quintessential Tuscany trip in June of 2026. We have one double room that is open now because of a cancellation, and it is wonderful. You'll just unpack for the week, staying in our own vegan villa, have the most incredible food. And if you want to connect with me, have intimate time together, meet new friends, hang out with like-minded people, have the most wonderful experience, support animal-friendly animal sanctuaries and vegan organizations, you're going to want to go to joyfulvegantrips.com. So in the meantime, hang on to your seats, go listen to this episode again, because I know there's a lot I'm sharing here. I hope it's getting you as excited about protein as I am right now, and I have a lot more to share. Until then, for the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening.